Apparently it is.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 18th event in the 2021 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbart and Carl Wilson. Last week, we had a wonderful conversation between Eric and Ann Powers about his new book, Songbooks, The Literature of American Popular Music. And next week on June 1st, Charles Hughes will be here to talk about his book, Why Bushwick Bill Matters. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021 schedule for Popular Music Books in Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. I also want to make a very quick plug for another IASPM event. The IASPM US Research Seminar will be on June 7th at 1:00 p.m. EDT on Zoom. It will be a roundtable discussion about new books by Black popular music scholars in the US with Elliot Powell, Daphne Brooks, Brittany Proctor, Matthew Morrison, and myself, and D'Angela Duff will be serving as the moderator. I will drop the registration link in the chat. Today, we're excited to have David Arditi, Kyle Barnett, and Jehnie Burns here to respectively talk about their books, Getting Signed, Record Contracts, Musicians, and Power in Society, Record Cultures, The Transformation of the US Recording Industry, and Mixtape Nostalgia, Culture, Memory, and Representation. David Arditi is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Arlington. He will be discussing his book, Getting Signed, Record Contracts, Musicians, and Power in Society, which explores the way musicians' dreams become their source of exploitation. David's newest book is Streaming Culture, Subscription Platforms and the Unending Consumption, which explores the changing nature of capitalism in a society that places subscriptions above material commodities. David is author of I Take Over, The Recording Industry in the Streaming Era, and co-editor of The Dialectic of Digital Culture. Kyle Barnett is an associate professor of media studies and graduate chair in the Department of Communication at Bellarmine University. His research focuses on media history, media industries, popular music, and sound across media. He has published in the Journal of Popular Music Studies, Music, Sound, and the Moving Image, the Journal of Material Culture, and several book anthologies. He is an occasional contributor to Jason Gross's longstanding webzine, Perfect Sound Forever, where he has written articles on the Volker Boatman, Stuart Hyatt's Fieldworks, and Revenant Records. Barnett is a former co-editor of The Velvet Light Trap and columnist for Flow, Antenna, and in Media Res. He is the author of Record Cultures, The Transformation of the US Recording Industry, and that came out last year from the University of Michigan Press. Jehnie Burns is an associate professor of history and community engagement at Point Park University. She'll be discussing her forthcoming book, Mixtape Nostalgia, Culture, Memory, and Representation, which analyzes the history of the mixtape in the world of cassettes and the continued representation of the mixtape. The project is a shift from Burns's earlier academic publications, which reflect her training as a cultural French historian. Her most recent article, Creating a New Community in the Zone Borders, Foreignness and the Cité Universitaire in Interwar Paris, was published in the Journal of Contemporary European Studies in 2017. Additional scholarship has appeared in Migrants and History of Education. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Eric will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Eric will find them there at the end of the discussion. So now I'll turn things over to David, Kyle, and Jehnie.
Thanks very much. I think I'm up first here, so I'll just jump in. The first question I think I'll answer is, why the hell did you write a book on the record industry in the 1920s? And so I showed up to my PhD program with the best of intentions. I was going to write a film studies dissertation, but I was in this department that were doing these amazing media industry histories. And so you'd get like, film industries in the 40s or like radio in the 30s. And they were these really targeted sort of histories. And I noticed that in media studies, the introductory books would always have a chapter on sound recording and popular music. But then all the upper level classes and in the graduate classes, like sound and music would come up, but it would always be in relation to those other media forms. And the recording industry as a formation would always be sort of invisible. And it like, so I figured, well, I'll never get a job doing that. So I was trying to work on this sort of film thing. And then of course the suppressed project kind of overtook the marquee project, and here I am. So so I wanted to do a kind of a recording industry history that was similar to the media histories I was seeing in radio and film and television, these really rich kind of targeted histories, rather than like an, sort of a omnibus history, which there's some great ones, obviously, particularly in popular music studies. But I wanted to do something more targeted. And then in 2010, I saw David Sanjic speak, I think it was 2010 at UCLA, and he was essentially calling for, he was calling for people in popular music studies to do what film studies had already done, to do these sort of targeted histories. So once I heard that from David, I just thought, oh, okay, so I'm on the right track. That felt good. The other thing, just a sort of biographical thing, is that my grandfather in Brownstown, Indiana, sort of Southern Indiana guy, ran the sort of town electric shop. And he sold white goods, which is sort of like, washer dryers, that sort of thing. And then brown goods, which is sort of radios, record players, and that sort of thing. So his house when I was a kid was just full of gear from RCA Victor and all these sort of record labels. And I was really, really curious about all the material. And so I think there was also that component. There was a kind of a built-in curiosity. So why the 1920s and 30s? The book Record Cultures really focuses on this period where it starts during World War I. There's this phonograph boom, right? There's this sort of, all these new companies are getting into the business for the first time. Much like the sort of late 90s and the internet boom, a bunch of people who hadn't been in it sort of just suddenly got into it. And then there's this great expansion of recorded sound practices. These new companies try to compete with the big three, and the big three at that point was Victor, Edison, and Columbia. And then they're just trying anything that might work. So they're recording, mining songs in Pennsylvania, and Swedish American immigrant music in Minnesota, and dance bands in Birmingham, and they're doing it all. And then the stuff that sold, right, the companies paid attention to the audience. They started to try and package musicians in different sorts of ways in this really provisional way. So these genres start to emerge around the stuff that's selling, and the stuff that's selling gets called old time music, later country, jazz, which is initially a very specific thing and then becomes sort of a stand-in for the music of the era, and then race records, which comes out of a discourse in the African-American press initially, and then gets picked up by OK Records and a bunch of other labels, and gets known as blues. But there's all sorts of practices that overlap and sort of within those genres, but they all emerge within about a 10-year period. And so I mapped that. Then near the end of the book, I talk about, the rise of radio and the Great Depression. And that is really, I think, from a media studies point of view, the really untold thing about that is, the record business is a standalone business through most of the 20s. But by the early 30s, for the first time, it's this major entertainment conglomeration. So Columbia becomes CBS, Victor becomes RCA Victor, Edison checks out of the business altogether a couple of weeks after the stock market crash. And then all these small labels that I talk about so much in the early part of the book, Jeanette, Paramount, okay, they get bought up. And some of them get parted out in different sorts of ways. Things are so bleak with Columbia Records in 1934 that they sell a home dry cleaning kit briefly. It was like a big tank. The ads only appeared once, so clearly it bombed. But so it's a really provisional period where they're making it up as they go along. But, you know, kind of proto A&R scouts are starting to develop, and all these practices that we're going to see later on repeat over and over and over are in their sort of, you know, nascent forms in certain ways during that period. So that's kind of how I got there, and then I just dug in from there. So is that about all my time? I don't want to go over. So.
All right, so I think I am up next. And so kind of building on what Kyle was just talking about, this idea of genres and A&R men, I'm going to focus my talk more on sort of the history of cassette culture a little bit. And I am trained as a French historian, and this project really kind of came out of left field. I had no intention of writing a book about mixtapes. It was just kind of a fun lark and as an aside, and then it just sort of grew, and I realized there was a fair amount there that I could write about. So the project really started about 5 years ago. I started to notice that mixtapes have just really remained relevant in popular culture in a way that I was curious about. So when I was in Chicago, I actually took a picture of a bejeweled clutch purse that's shaped like a cassette with the word party mix emblazoned on it in glitter. I was at the Strand in New York City, and I found refrigerator magnets shaped like mixtapes. My son bought me a flash drive that is shaped like a mixtape with a USB in it. And so the more I started thinking about it, I was wondering why, because cassettes are a mostly dead medium. Young people tend to listen to music digitally, but why is there this continued fascination with cassette culture, but more specifically with the I made you this tape to tell you that I like you mixtape? So to really start thinking about it, I'm going to give you quotes from a couple of people who have a fair amount of cultural cachet in sort of pop culture land, Lin-Manuel Miranda and David Byrne. So in a 2017 interview about Hamilton, Miranda said, and this is a quote of his, "Mixtapes were an important part of the friendship and mating rituals of New York adolescence. If you were a girl and I wanted to show you I liked you, I would make you a 90-minute cassette, subliminally telling you how much I like you with all of these songs. You're learning about rise and fall and energy and tempo shifts. You're showing off your tastes and your references. You're trying to be witty through placement of music you didn't write. And so it's no accident the name for my show is the Hamilton Mixtape. And the reason I made the distinction cassette before CD is you have to listen to it in the order that I curated it for you." And so here you have someone like Miranda talking about how important mixtapes were for him as a young person, but also how they continued when he started creating his own work. And then David Byrne, in his book, How Music Works, he wrote, "The mixtapes we made for ourselves were musical mirrors. The sadness, anger, or frustration you might be feeling at a given time could be encapsulated in a song selection. You made mixtapes that corresponded to emotional states, and they'd be available to pop into the deck when each feeling needed reinforcing or soothing. The mixtape was your friend, your psychiatrist, and your solace." So these two quotes really capture my project. It's about the cassette, but it's more about the meaning that's injected into the cassette, and it's about the memory and the emotion of time goes by. And so the crux of my project really is defined by the nostalgia piece of the mixtape and why it's persisted for so long. So in the book, I talk about novels like High Fidelity, Perks of Being a Wallflower, about films like Guardians of the Galaxy, and a fair amount of it is about ephemera, board games, microbrewered beer, t-shirts, things like that. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. What I really want to do for right now, though, is to sort of tie some of my early chapters into what Kyle and David are talking about today, and look at sort of the musical self-production and the history of the cassette and how that turned into individuals making cassette tapes. So a lot of it comes out of the idea in the 1960s and 70s of the recording companies as sort of arbiters of defining and making music culture. And in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of young artists who rejected these ideas and were trying to think about how to make their own music outside of mainstream labels. Magnetic tape recording reduced the cost, reduced the need for a studio, and it'll let artists make music that didn't fit into the boxes of the labels. And the two genres that are the most heavily defined by this are punk and hip hop. And so that's where there's a lot of overlap. And 40 years later, you still see there's a greater investment in cassette culture in those two genres still. So late 1950s, American companies CBS and 3M were trying to advance magnetic radio recording technology. And building on this work, Lou Ottens, who is from the Netherlands and worked in the audio division of Philips, created the first audio cassette. It was called the Pocket Cassette. And these were really created as dictation machines. There was no intention of this being for music playback. They had 5 goals for the project. It had to be a simple construction, had to be reliable. It had to protect the tape because everything at this point was reel to reel. It needed to have low energy consumption, and it had to be the smallest possible dimension that could play 30 minutes. They introduced the compact cassette in 1963 in Berlin. And for the next decade, what they really worked on was improving the sound quality so it was somewhat equivalent to a long play record. The most profound shift in the popularity of the cassette was the creation of the personal stereo. So in 1979, Sony released the first Walkman, and it created what they called an individual sonic space. And the Walkman became a billion-dollar industry. It sold 50 million units in the first 10 years, 220 million units over its lifespan. And Andre Millard, who wrote A History of Recorded Sound, said that the universal popularity of the Walkman ensured that the tape cassette would become the dominant form of sound recording in the last quarter of the 20th century. And then, at least in that same decade, was the personal stereo was the boombox, which became really an icon of a new generation of young people. And when Philips had taken, what Philips had done was created a tape that people could play. The Walkman allowed people to play it through headphones, which is a totally new concept in the 70s. And what the boombox did was added high quality speakers. And so while Walkmans were really personal, boomboxes were really social. And you find that boomboxes become particularly popular in urban areas, and they really have a greater tie to sort of the hip hop generation of both dance and musicians. A 1979 Billboard article discussing hip hop talked about it as countless portable tape players that are carried through the city streets. So really seeing this as a particular icon of young people in city centers. And then at the same time that you have this technological advancement, you have in the 60s and the 70s this counterculture movement that has this anti-consumer, anti-capitalist, anti-mainstream America bent, and individuals who are speaking out against consumerism and greed. And so within that sort of anti-establishment identity, you have the growth of bootlegging and piracy, and that becomes another part of sort of youth culture. And so specifically looking at things like music festivals, fans become more concrete in their fandom, and they start thinking about the role of the record companies, and they start to believe that the record companies are releasing what they thought people wanted to hear as opposed to everything that was available. So if you think about the rise of the Deadhead, this really highlights the fandom best. The band began to release their own live bootleg recordings, which fans wanted to hear. This was part about making their music available, but it also reflected their commitment to non-commercialism, taking control over their art and removing it from the capitalist power of the industry. So bringing the technology back in, as you have Deadhead shows, fans are using tape players to copy and share those recordings amongst themselves. And in this venue, bootlegging is less about sales and money, but it became a model that created the market for music outside of commercial sales. And it's really going to sort of lead into what's going to become the mixtape. So the combination of these two ideas, the technology and that counterculture identity, really allows people to sort of have control of their own music in a new way. So super quick, I'm just going to talk about how rap and punk use that to a certain extent. Rap, developing in the late 1970s, the earliest mixtapes are called customized tapes, and those are live recordings of rappers in New York City parks. And so by the 1980s, early 1980s, you have those shows that are moving from parks to indoor clubs, and DJs are recording live shows, making copies of them on the fly and selling them. And there's a big discussion in the world of hip hop between selling and sharing that still exists in 21st century mixtapes because of sampling and the legality of it. For example, Brucey B, he was a DJ from the Bronx. He began marketing and selling live audio recordings of his sets at a disco roller rink in New York. And people were paying up to $100 to have a live recording of the event that they were at. And so that's where you start to get this idea of cassette tapes and live recordings of individual outside of recording company venues being able to be marketable. Punk musicians, sort of the antithesis of what Kyle was talking about, they really are finding that record companies don't see them as a marketable kind of music, and they are trying to figure out how to get a fan base. And so they really rely heavily on live performance. And so for them, releasing albums on cassette is an inexpensive way to get music to their audience. They don't have to work within the studio labels, and they are able to make music on their own terms. This is where you really get the personal mixtape in a lot of ways, because a lot of these punk musicians are sharing music amongst themselves, pulling individual songs and creating compilation tapes. And this is where you really start to get this conversation about sharing music in between people. It starts with the musicians, and it's going to kind of move out from there. So a lot of the foundational mixtape stories really come from punk fans who turn into musicians themselves. So 2 decades, cassette tape really dominates the industry. Labels sell music on both vinyl and cassette in the 1980s and 1990s. Even though cassette really overlaps with the growth of the CD, cassettes remain at least 25% of all music sales through 1994. And even as late as 1993, the sale of cassettes and CDs is pretty comparable. Music fans really connected the lessons learned from bootlegging and from artists to realize they could record their own music and personalize the listening experience. Dual deck cassette tapes players really expanded the ease and the ability to allow people to make mixtapes. So by the mid-1980s, mixtapes are really a fundamental aspect of mainstream American youth culture. Creating a mixtape had become a tangible investment. The time spent crafting the label, choosing the music, perfecting the track length, demonstrated a tangible investment in the music, the art, and the person the mixtape was intended for. And music became a venue for sharing emotion wordlessly. And this is something I talk about a fair amount in the book, is how it allows young people to express their emotions without ever having to say anything about it. It was reflected in novels and music of the time, everyone from Bret Easton Ellis in Less Than Zero to Alan Warner, who wrote Morven Caller, as using mixtapes as a way to sort of tell stories. Artists like Ben Folds 5, the Beastie Boys, they start writing songs and they talk about mixtape in their lyrics. There are more than 75 songs that have mixtapes in their lyrics that have been released from the 1990s up through today. And the number of songs is actually increasing, even though we live far away from the land of cassette culture. So individuals who made mixtapes really viewed them as labors of love. Road trip mixtapes had a different feel than breakup ones, which were distinct from Declaration of a Crush type tapes. They allowed consumers to become producers and DJs, where you could infuse your own personality into your creation inexpensively without a lot of technological experience. Mixtape recipients coveted their mixtapes because they were artistic, thoughtful, personally constructed tokens of communication, sharing, and connection. And 40 years later, most of us still have stories about the boxes of cassettes we have tucked away that we can't listen to, but we still own. So I will leave it there, and I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Jehnie. So I just dropped a discount code for the book that came out, Getting Signed. And before I did that, I clicked on the wrong file. So you also got the free PDF version that I didn't accidentally put on there. Oops. So enjoy. I'm going to do something a little different. I actually have a presentation to show. The way I thought about this was to talk a little bit about the book, but then kind of give a talk about one of the chapters. One of the chapters I don't usually talk very much about, but I think it's a really important one that can, that it's on something that needs to be discussed. So I will share this now. Can everybody see my screen? All right. So there's the information. I'm David Arditi, and Getting Signed, Record Contract Musicians in Power and Society. The chapter that I'm going to present today is on this organization called Coast to Coast Live. I don't know if anybody's heard of this, but it's chapter 7 or 8, I believe, in my book, and it is about what I call a confidence game that this organization does. They try to exploit what I call the ideology of getting signed to get young aspiring artists to pay money to go on stage, and I'll show you how exploitative it is here in a moment. That's Coast to Coast Live. And so this stems from an experience I had at a Coast to Coast Live artist showcase. And I think that this connects both to Kyle and Jehnie's books because it taps into, number one, the idea of the talent scouting model that Kyle's book discusses. And very oddly, I mean, not oddly, as Jehnie just described, they have a product called Coast to Coast Mixtape. But the whole thing's a big scam. So the ideology of getting signed, I'm going to read a little bit about the project and then get into the other part. So when I started the project, I wanted to understand, why do musicians want to sign record contracts? I knew record contracts were exploitative, and as musicians lasted longer in the industry, their desire declined after learning the reality of signing these contracts. And as I did my research, the question didn't interest me as much as the way the desire proliferates in society more generally. So I began to ask the question, how does the ideology of getting signed permeate society to convince musicians to sign record contracts? So getting signed explores the desire, which I call the ideology of getting signed. Basically, regardless of genre, aspiring musicians dream of signing a record contract. While this may have different meanings across class, race, and gender lines, many musicians possess the feeling that a record contract will make them rich and famous. This is a social phenomenon that exists outside individuals and persists across time. It's been around since the early days of the recording industry. Furthermore, the ideology exists throughout society as the major aspirational achievement that non-musicians expect musicians to pursue. There is a widespread belief among non-musicians and aspiring musicians that these record contracts bring incredible wealth to anyone who signs one because of the large sums of money earned by a few artists. Non-musicians and musicians alike internalize the ideology of getting signed. Non-musicians encourage musicians to pursue these contracts, and musicians believe that record contracts will bring them wealth and fame. Excuse me, I've been getting over a cold. All right, so Coast to Coast Live. By happen chance, I stumbled upon this confidence game that directly exploits the dream of young musicians who want record labels to notice and to sign them. So I'd been to a number of showcases. I went to different kind of, I'm blanking on what some of them are called, but basically they're conferences where sometimes where bookers go to find musicians coming through town. So they'll go there, they pay a fee to get in, and they can go from room to room to kind of sample musicians. And so there's lots of different showcases like this. There's label showcases. This thing sells itself as a label showcase. I found this by running a search for Music Showcase Dallas. I went to, this is close by to me. Everything in the book is anonymous. There's not pictures in the book, but we'll just go with it. So I go, and I'm thinking this is going to be some big thing, right? So I show up. It starts at 9 o'clock. I arrive at 8:30. I thought I could hang out inside and talk to people, you know, interview artists. When I get there, there's kind of this cast of characters out there. This is before this. There was a guy who had like a hat on. He had two phones, one phone. He was like texting people on the other phone. He had in his hat, so it was like showing outwards. And he was promoting his cousin's music. It was playing on SoundCloud. And I mean, the guy was a complete character. He's like telling me about the Coast to Coast Live dancers are going to show up at 10. They're beautiful. Excuse me. It wasn't the case. So I'm hanging out. There's nowhere for me to go in. Finally, at 9 o'clock, the host, who I call Little Eminem, he lines everybody up at 9, and he's like artists in the front. So then I realized, oh man, some of these people that are hanging out are actually the people that are going to compete in the showcase. I figured they were already in. So we get the artists lined up first. Most of the people I was standing around were friends and family. There wasn't just like a natural audience. It was friends and family. The bouncer didn't care about tickets, which were $10, but you could have just printed off as many tickets as you wanted to. It didn't really matter. So this is seeming weird to me immediately. So we get in and the artists line up at the stage, and they receive badges when they register. So there's a particular materiality of the badges that made the artists feel like they were a part of something. They served no real purpose. And I could see money being exchanged. So one guy here, you could see he's got like cash and he's doling it out. So immediately I'm like, oh, what's going on here? then the whole thing just kind of felt like a cheesy prom to me or something, like after prom. So you've got this backdrop in the corner here, off to the side, there's like a camera set up where they have a backdrop and they take official pictures and everything. Then this is the DJ. So this is a good quote from the book. During the interlude between registration and performance, DJ and I, they're pseudonyms. I kind of took what their original name was and changed it. DJ Luz tried to, quote, turn up the crowd. And it just seemed weird hearing the 40-something DJ use contemporary slang. It just struck me as odd. And DJ Luz punctuated his beats with exhortations for, quote, 21 and up, hit that bar, get that drink, leave that tip. If you're underage, get that soda and water. If you live in, put your hands in the air. And then at this point, I felt as though I was at some weird middle school dance with the struggling DJ trying to be cool as everyone compulsorily kind of put their hands in the air, but no one seemed ready to turn up. Like no one was turning up. It was bad. So I'm wondering how much is it? Because then I hear people talking at the bar, and the dude's like, man, I just spent 2 weeks pay doing this. Because they're like teenagers. They're between maybe 16 and 23. And I'm like, dude, that makes no sense. You know, I'm thinking maybe he was giving him $50. Turns out it was $300. And you got to put $150 up front. And it's just this highly exploitative thing. Here's DJ Luz taking a picture of the star DJ, who's a judge who, I went to his, I searched his social medias, he's got no gigs other than this thing. So there's this whole ploy that you're going to go there, you're going to be seen by people, and there's nobody really there to see you. I was probably the most industry person there was there, and I'm just a professor of sociology, right? Like it was all family and friends. So these are the prizes you win, and I don't know how I'm doing on time. But you can see the first place, you get all this stuff, but getting that stuff is actually nothing because it's actually stuff you would pay for on the website that actually has no value. So like here you got 250 spins on Coast to Coast Radio at a $600 value. Nobody listens to Coast Radio. If you're paying $600 for that, like you're out. You get a spot on their Coast to Coast Mixtape, which is a $400 value. It's all complete fabrication, right? Meanwhile, these people are spending $300. Now, I did the math, and then I'll stop kind of after this, but basically $300 per person. There's 20 people, so just that gig alone, they're Coast to Coast Live, just from participants, it's about $6,000. Oh, and none of this is easy to find. So what I had to do was I had to pretend to submit something, because that's when they tell you that there's a charge. I found out the $300 from somewhere else, but it's this whole bait thing. I had to go back and forth with them. So there's like, if you look at their website before COVID, they're starting to get cranked up again. They do 5 shows per week, which is $35,000 per week they bring in. They'd have 2 teams doing 5 shows a week. So it's actually like 70 grand per week, 52 weeks. So this organization from this brings in $3.6 million. And this is just part of the scam, because then they have this thing called direct to exec, where people pay like a subscription for $200 a month, and they can go in front of quote unquote A&R people, but it's just somebody with a laptop or a tablet kind of ranking them. I think I've gone on for more than 10 minutes. So I'll just end on the fact that they drive this dream to sign a record contract. And that's what this whole book is about. So I'll stop at that. Should I ask the first question?
Go for it.
All right, so Jehnie, my question will start with you since I've seen the project develop. And I know that you've had a pretty big change recently in the structure of the book. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about the old structure and the way you were kind of thinking about the book before you moved it to more of a chronological structure.
Sure. So I have moved it. So here's the thing. I'm a historian, and as a historian, chronological is boring. And so you find other thematic ways to do your history. And so I went thematic, and then my peer reviewer said, no, I want chronological. So I went back to a more chronological focus of the book. But when I first had structured the book, I had an entire chapter on the history of the cassette, which is a lot of what you guys just heard. But then I had it organized more around the type of creative outlet that people were talking about the mixtape. So there's an entire chapter that was specifically on musicians who use mixtape in their lyrics, and this real emotional nostalgia idea of, I remember when we were 17, or that summer before our senior year. And one of the things that was interesting to me in there really is that has actually grown since about 2013. And when you get to an artist like Cody Simpson, who's 16, asking a girl in a song, but would he make you a mixtape? That was the moment that I was like, there's something interesting going on here, because Cody Simpson has never owned a cassette player. He's probably never known how to make a mixtape on a tape. And then I go through all of the novels, and there's a huge number of novels that talk about mixtapes, but it moves from mixtapes as a lived reality, what you see in something like High Fidelity, which is sort of the text, everyone references High Fidelity, to where you get to a much more contemporary story where you have young adult books that are using stories that take place in the 80s and 90s, and the mixtape represents this a way for people to connect emotionally. So that was really kind of what caught my attention, is how we move through time from mixtape is just, yeah, they're there, we don't really think about them, to now mixtape is this idea, this context that we're using about this simpler emotional analog past. And then as I get to the end, I have an entire chapter, which is still my last contemporary chapter, that's really looking at all of the stuff. And that's where, to me, it was one of the most fun chapters, because you have a board game called Mixtape the Board Game, which is all about analog cassettes. He originally was going to call it Soundtrack, and he has since, the creator has now sold it. It is available at Target, but he has now made it an app that you can play on Spotify. So we've had some conversations about what makes it a mixtape versus a playlist. You can go to any mall and find yoga pants that have cassettes covered in them. If you look up mixtape in Etsy, it's interesting because there's a distinction between a cassette and a mixtape. So it's not just cassette culture. One of my favorite items that I found is a $6,000 hand-carved coffee table. And the really important thing for this mixtape coffee table, it's not just a cassette table. He very specifically says it's a mixtape table, there's a carved side A and a carved side B. So you can flip that table over and have whichever side you want. And so that's what really kind of fascinated me with all of this stuff, is how you see people using mixtape as an idea. It's different from like there's Record Day. We know about Record Day. There's now a Cassette Day as well, and you can go buy cassettes, and people are now releasing cassettes. The top 4 selling cassettes in 2020 were Guardians of the Galaxy, Awesome Mix Volume 1, Awesome Mix Volume 2, cassette that they released based on a cartoon series for Guardians of the Galaxy, and then Billie Eilish. And so there is that aspect of cassette culture, but it's distinct from mixtape culture. Mixtape culture is really about the nostalgia. So yeah, that was kind of how it was set up now. Now it's a little bit more chronological, but that was where I started. So, thanks, David. Kyle, do you want to ask me a conversation?
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like a good moment to ask you a question too, Jehnie. Like, so I loved that your project's so rooted in materiality. Like, you're always taking us back to the things, and so and so often we, at least in media studies, we focus on narratives or scenes or something, but like the objects get lost sometimes, and so I really love that. I was thinking about mixtapes and their nostalgic appeal, and it's sort of the persistence of the nostalgia. But so is there something specific to our mixtape nostalgia that's different from maybe other musical nostalgias. So like in the early writing about like Walkmans and then later, iPods and that sort of thing, I think people sort of said, oh, it's shutting out the world. But I always thought it was also like about intimacy and ways of sharing music, stopping someone and say, oh, what are you listening to? And then there was this sort of personal thing to it. And your work, like with these objects, sort of gets to that. But I was wondering about sort of the shareability side of the nostalgia versus the sort of intimacy of the nostalgia, and how we might be defining a sort of a very specific mixtape nostalgia as opposed to other forms. You're already kind of working on that, I think, about cassette culture versus mixtapes, but
yeah, I think it's a good question, because a lot of, and one of the things that I know I've talked to David about is this specifically Gen X, or is it still mixtapes when you're making it on CDs? And if you're making a mixtape as a playlist on Spotify, is that still a mixtape, and what's the difference? And I think part of it for me is the difference with like the cassette culture versus the record is that you could personalize it. So obviously the ability to record your own tape, I think, is a big part of the conversation. But when you start reading a lot of the people who are so heavily invested in the mixtape, it's the time that's spent. It's the ability to take 6 songs and figure out exactly how long they are and how much time you need between the songs so that you don't have 3 minutes of dead air at the end of the cassette. And so when you can download a playlist and drop and drag songs onto a playlist digitally, that makes it less special and less personal. And so even for some people, the difference between a cassette and a CD is distinct because it is that analog. There's I talk a fair amount about sort of retromania and sort of this love of the analog. And it is this idea of moving us away from the digital and away from the ease. And it's spending the time. And then I think the other piece of the materiality of it is there's a ton of discussion about the J cards and the art that you're making on the covers. And so Thurston Moore, he wrote a book called Mixtape, The Art of Cassette Culture. And one of the biggest things in that book, it's not a history, but it is individual stories, and every single page has the J card. And some of them are just people's handwritings with a Sharpie, and some of them are heavily DIY, cutting out from zines. So I think that's really a big part of it with the cassette is the physicality, the DIY-ness of punk. And there's a certain section where I start talking about Riot Girl a little bit and some of that as well. So sort of that zine culture and that attention to detail and attention to time. So I think that's really where the cassette kind of plays into all of it. So good question. Cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
And as long as I'm on, I'll go ahead and ask you a question, Kyle.
Yeah.
We'll just go in that round if that's all right. Okay.
Sure.
So Kyle, when I was in college, I took a history of music class from a professor named Bill Malone. And he wrote a lot about, hillbilly music and early recordings of hillbilly music. And I guess what I was wondering as I was looking at your work is how much does location and regionalism, especially with radio play, affect how these record labels are thinking about their artists? Do you find that there's sort of a national identity of what these genres are? Because you think of sort of hillbilly as being Southern Appalachian and race as being tied more to a specific demographic, but also I think it's either Chicago or New Orleans if you're thinking about jazz. So I was wondering how the intersection of sort of these radio label genres and radio play, if that changes anything.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting question. Like, so, I mean, I would just begin with the sort of question about regionalism. Like when I started to dig into this history of the recording industry in the 20s, everything I sort of assumed was the situation wasn't the situation. So I didn't realize the extent to which the record business in that era was really sort of concentrated in the Northeast, right? So in and around New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and they were recording what was nearby, and so it wasn't really until these sort of upstart record companies in Great Lakes, Midwest, they first started making phonograph cabinets for like Edison and those big companies. Then they started making phonographs. Finally, they started making records. So going from hardware to software, and they're just recording stuff that's around them. And so it coincides with this great migration of African Americans, as well as sort of rural whites coming to the Great Lakes Midwest for work, at the very same time that these companies are moving west to these sort of these industrial locales. So, you know, Charlie Patton isn't recorded down south. He's recorded in Grafton, Wisconsin, and Richmond, Indiana, right? Two places that are never come up in conversations about, you know, music cities, right? So a lot of the music we associate with New Orleans was recorded in the rural or urban American Midwest. And so like all these assumptions just really kind of, I started to realize like, I don't nearly understand what I thought I did when I started this project. The other thing I would say is that, you know, it's really jazz first that become of the big three sort of emerging genres of the era. It's jazz, then it's sort of race records, old time or hillbilly or, you know, whatever you want to call it, sort of proto country music only really starts getting recorded in earnest in 1927. Like it's late, it's really, really late. And part of that I think is down to the regional aspects. You know, it's not close to where they're recording in the Northeast, but I think there's also some real class dynamics. You see it in African-American discourse around race records, and you see it in sort of, you know, European, you know, Anglo-American, you know, white conversations about country, that there's this sort of like, we're not very comfortable, there's class issues, right? And so by the time that country is emerging, you know, sort of old time or hillbilly, it's emerging at the same time radio is, right? It's really becoming a national medium. And so radio cleans it up and kind of vaudevilles it up and makes it more acceptable for barn dance radio. But it's odd, right, to me that a genre that defines itself as old time music from the start, right? So Michelle Helms calls, you know, these barn dance shows, you know, coming from the backwoods of modernity. So you have like this genre that's emerging as a nostalgic formation from the get-go, but it's on the most modern of media forms during the period, right? It's on radio. So that to me is just, so I guess what I'm trying to point to here is just like all these contradictory sort of paradoxical relationships of the period that just, I think, I mean, certainly Bill Malone, I get some of it from Bill Malone, certainly Richard Peterson, some of those great writers on Hillbilly, and Barry Mazur's book on Ralph Peer later. I mean, there's some really great work. But yeah, it's, I could see why this wouldn't have started in the Northeast, and it took radio, I think, for it to really take off. There's another conversation to be had about regional media becoming national media, but I'll bracket that for the moment. So. Thank you. Is it my turn for a David question? And I'm seeing some great questions in the chat that we should tend to as well. And so, so David, I quite liked reading the excerpt I got to read from your book and thinking about getting signed as this kind of discourse, right? And even when I was in these sort of tiny indie bands, which was sort of like a poker night, but with a van, you know, doing these little shows, like people would ask, "Oh, do you think you'll get signed?" Like, you know, it seems so distant to us in terms of what we were thinking of. But when do you sort of place it as? Is there a high period for getting signed as discourse? Like, were there conditions that had to be right for getting signed to be, like, I mean, I guess not knowing as much as you, I would sort of think about the 1970s when sort of live music is becoming really corporatized and the whole business is getting bigger. And then, you know, to me at that point, getting signed becomes something really huge. Before that, I think of garage bands doing a 45 or 2 or, you know, some of that sort of thing. But it sounds like maybe it goes back much farther than I might imagine. But I guess sort of, how do you map the discourse over time and what conditions made it right? Both the desire in musicians and the sort of corporate manipulation of the same. That was a very long articulation. Sorry.
Well, that's a great question. I really didn't. I don't delve into the history of where this came from.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in my own kind of context of it, I think the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, with the rise of rock and roll is when you start getting that. And you think about the, what's the name of that, the movie of the young woman following the band around? Can't think of it.
The Cameron Crowe film?
Almost Famous?
Almost Famous, right?
Yeah.
Like it was that period of time where I think kind of sex, drugs, rock and roll became big. And really part of the ideology of getting signed is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So the kind of counter to the argument that I make throughout the book, and I get to this in the conclusion, is when you first start with the recording industry, people didn't necessarily want to sign a record contract, right? It becomes big. And what people often say to me now, and it's completely not what I found and not what I think happens, people try to say that it's not important to get signed to a record contract today. And that couldn't be further from the truth in my research. So now people want to sign record contracts because record contracts have the kind of marketing support that gets people to blow up. So in a lot of books that have come out recently, people begin to look at that and say, well, you know, the recording industry, anyone can produce their own album, but not anyone can become Beyonce. If you want to become Beyonce, the only way to do that is to go through the recording industry. The vast majority of people are not going to become Beyonce. I think Beyonce and Jay-Z are billionaires now, right? That's not the kind of typical route that people are going to take. So the dream is still there. I still think it's at its high watermark. And one of the things that I look at in the chapter where I kind of explain ideology a lot is really that even when people have an alternative ideology, it's still coded in signing a record contract. So even when people work against the grain, they want to sign to some indie label, and that supports that ideology, even if it's its own form of resistance to it. So I think it's a good question. I'm not sure kind of when it really got cranking, but I think it's still there.
That's really fascinating. I just was going to add, like in my research in the 20s, people were signed. Some of the most sort of successful artists were kind of signed. I mean, this is a period where A&R men wasn't really, people were called record men. I call them talent scouts because I feel like record men comes with its own problems. And A&R men didn't really exist yet as a term, but almost immediately artists that were signed started doing recordings for other companies under pseudonyms, like almost immediately. And some of the fun of like the record collectors have is sort of figuring out like, who is that, who appears on this side or who appears on that side, like really, really early on. So to me, that's the counter dynamic, right? Is sort of like the promise and desire of it being signed versus the, sort of the prison of it, I guess, in certain ways too. So that's really cool.
Well, what you're talking about, it kind of connects to something I wanted to ask you, and I think it connects to Jehnie, because now we're talking about the kind of materiality that when you bring up sides, and I see people talking about the 90-minute cassette versus the 120-minute cassette. And for me, the biggest thing that happened in early record culture was the very fact that the Berliner gramophone only held about 3 minutes of music per side, right? And this has had an over-determining effect on popular music ever since then. And so when we see these new forms pop up, it remains the same. So whether, you get to the longer LPs in the 1970s where people were still making 3-minute songs. People are still making 3-minute songs today. You get to the tape and you get to a problem that Jehnie was mentioning where what do you do with the empty space, right? So then it becomes all about cutting it up to make sure like, oh, well, we have 75 minutes of music, but we need to get it on a 60-minute tape. So, this 15 minutes is out. And then, so I think that there's a lot of kind of connections in that direction.
Yeah, I would agree.
And your comment about 60-minute tapes, when cassettes are first created, like I said, they're first created as for dictation machines. And the reason they get viewed as something that you can play music on, it's actually when you put cassette players in cars. And they put 8-track players in cars first, and then very quickly realized that compact cassettes are more durable than an 8-track. And it very specifically is that they want to be able to take LPs and dub them onto cassettes. So they have to be the same length as the LPs. And so that's how you get 60-minute cassettes. It very definitely is, how do we take what we already had? And the biggest debate talking about that 60 versus 120 minutes of cassette was the quality. The audio quality is so much lower on the cassette tapes. And until they create Dolby sound, which can sort of digitally make that sound better, people aren't interested in using cassettes because the sound is so bad. Now in 2021, you can actually download an app that if you are using, you are trying to use GarageBand and make your own music, you can actually add tape hiss into your sound. So it sounds more authentically analog. So again, that materiality of what people like is the hiss of the tape. So, yeah.
Hey, let me interject. I think we probably should bring in some of the folks who've been plugging away in the chat into the conversation itself. So if it's cool, I'm going to call on folks. Probably just time for each person to ask one question, but if you have questions that work for all the panelists, that's great too. David Sussman, I think way back in the early days of this discussion, you were in there first.
Okay, hi everybody. I just had shoulder surgery this morning, and so I'm only like not 100% in here. But I had this. I love this conversation, and the thing I wanted to ask that sort of brings your presentations together too is really for Kyle about the way that your work. I see it as making this intervention that shows the problem of equating the record industry, the music industry, and the music industries, plural. And that your work shows how the lines between them get blurred and how interdependent they are. And I was thinking, like, just as one example, David, in your Coast to Coast Live is a part of the music industries. It is part of the political economy of music. But it's a tangential part. And so I was just wondering, Kyle, if you could talk more, or anybody else, about what's at stake in problematizing the way that we tend to think about the record industry as a stand-in, as a synecdoche for the music industries as a whole and plural.
Oh yeah, thanks for that, David. And I lean on your book in no small way. Early on, especially, we're talking about music, the history of music publishing, and getting all that right. So I owe you a lot in that regard, certainly. So I wanted to say recording industry and not music industry or music industries because first, recorded sound released by recording companies is not limited to music. Right, so there's a long history of spoken word recordings, including some really kind of proto-radio recordings. I was listening to the Nation's Forum records from the 19-teens, and it's basically like, general Pershing, from the battlefields of Europe, sort of convincing Americans that World War I is a good idea, right? And there's presidential speeches, and there's physical fitness records, and there's a whole universe of things that don't really sort of strictly fit in media studies because it's phonography, and it doesn't fit in music studies really because it's not music. So I wanted to sort of hold out a space where like I could talk about recorded culture more broadly. The other thing is, the music industry, that can be like music publishing. It could be, band instruments. It could be, sort of music distribution. There's a lot of different sorts of practices. I'm also really sort of conscious of the ways in which it's really a global, mega conglomerate operation, and it's folks like running labels out of their garage. And so I was trying to sort of choose carefully in terms of how I couched it so I could kind of point to those. I think Eric Harvey and I, we co-edited a Creative Industries Journal issue where we, I think, tried to articulate some of that a bit further, at least in the intro. But I appreciate it. So I hope that helps. But I appreciate the question. And I hope the shoulder recovers nicely.
Jehnie or David, did you want to tackle the question of record industry versus music industry?
I mean, I think it's a great example of kind of how these different different segments of the big culture industry operate, right? I always kind of think in those terms, but then within that you have all these different things. And right now there's kind of a reformation going on. And I think thinking about Kyle's book, I mean, you had these kind of moments where publishing was the biggest, then radio becomes the biggest, then the recording industry. And today, I think before the past year, I think a lot of people would say live music industry had really been growing in the size of revenue. The kind of mega concerts that are going on around the world. So you absolutely have to draw those distinctions.
And I think the only thing I would add is just in that conversation about bootlegging and piracy, very often you see the recording industry saying the artists don't like when their stuff is taken. And you see the artists saying, we have no problem with it. So kind of fighting against the fact that the musicians themselves don't want to be labeled as part of the industry. And so you see that like with sampling, or even some of the conversations like home taping is killing music. Very often the artists are saying, we're okay with that. And really in some cases doing sort of stick in the eye sort of to the industry, sort of, so again, to show that the musicians themselves don't see themselves necessarily as part of whatever that recording industry is.
Cool. I'm just going to make a note because I'm hearing you and watching Kyle on the chat, which is very disorienting. All the panelists, we do share with you the full content of the chat text afterwards, so you will get a chance to see that. Don't feel like you have to feverishly take notes on that part now, okay? So I just wanted to calm Kyle down on that one point.
Oh, thank you so much. It means a lot. I'm so grateful.
I apologize for the split perspective there for a second, Jehnie. I've made this mistake before by just saying the word Carl, so let me be clearer. Carl Miller, would you like to come in and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Eric. And I want to just start by saying I'm a big fan of Kyle's book, and I've ordered David's book while we're talking, and I'm waiting for Jenny's book, and this is a great conversation. But I want to direct my question to David. And it's a bit of a riff on what Kyle asked you, David. I'm thinking about the history of the urge to sign a record contract. And I'm finishing up a book on amateur music making, and a big part of it is this amateur dream. And I love how you threw up Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism, and I'm using that too. I'm looking at the Major Bowes Amateur Hour of the 1930s, which was the top show on radio in the 1930s, which serves this fever dream of amateur musicians making it. And at that point, it was getting on the radio show, and at your point, it's getting on, getting a record contract. But I'm wondering if I want to ask a question. Your Coast to Coast example is a marginal industry exploiting amateur dreams. Is this the major model of the mainstream music industry as well? Or is there a difference between this marginalized Coast to Coast and major record labels?
Thanks, Carl. You know, that's a great question. And so what I try to do in the book is to say, this is a very clear confidence game. They are quite clearly running a scam. I mean, if you go there, there was a whole big thing. After I went there, I went online and looked it up. I forget what the music news site is, but they had gotten into it, and Coast to Coast threatened to sue them. It was this whole phenomenon, right? But the chapter before it in the book is about The Voice. And those kind of shows do the exact kind of same thing, right? So on The Voice, they're every bit as exploited, if not more. You know, supposedly Coast to Coast does award $50,000 prize at the end of the year. It's this kind of this pyramid scheme. You go to a bigger competition if you win the little ones, and there you can win 50 grand, which you probably have a greater chance of winning that than winning The Voice. You win $100,000 in a record contract. But you go on The Voice and you compete for up to 8 months and you get nothing. So I really kind of outline that in the book, right? So that's the same thing. And then when you look at just the idea of signing a record contract, the whole exploitative nature of it is the vast majority of the people that sign the record contract are never going to recoup their advance. And many of them, they're going to sign it and their album's going to get shelved, right? So if you are someone who takes your music very seriously and you sign up to sign a record contract, is one of the worst things you could do is sign up for it, because as soon as you sign the record contract, you're at the whim of whoever you signed with at the A&R person. I talked to one person, the A&R left, was a big name A&R person. They went to another label and the band was just kind of left in limbo, where that A&R guy really cared about the band, right? So the idea that those dreams exist is kind of part and parcel to the whole system.
Yeah, the dreams exist, and I would also just say, like you're saying, the free labor exists at every step of the way. Yeah, so I appreciate your work, man. I look really forward to checking out your book. And I will.
Thank you.
I'll do the discount rather than the free PDF.
It's all good.
There seems to be nostalgia now for getting ripped off, which could connect David and Jehnie's book. There's a show that I just saw one episode of called like Five Eva or something like that, about like the reunion of a singing group from the Total Request Live days. And they seem to actually pine to be more exploited once again, but I could be getting that wrong. I only saw one episode. Carl Wilson this time.
Hi. Yeah, this has been great, everybody. I had a question for Jehnie about the kind of historiography you were laying out, in the sense of you seem to sort of be suggesting that the model of the mixtape came from artists first and then being emulated by fans. And this is, anecdotal, but substantial too, I think. As a child of the late 70s, I feel like just having a portable cassette machine, the first thing that I remember doing with it with friends was like making imaginary radio shows and things like that, like just emulating anything that was out there. And I feel like in my life, there was a smooth continuum between those kinds of bottom-up consumer uses to like taping albums to making mixtapes. And I don't feel like I knew that there were artists created versions of that out there in that process. Although obviously there was a mixtape culture there when I joined it. So I'm just curious about that kind of bottom-up narrative.
Yeah.
You know?
Thank you. A really good question. I think oversimplification when I said it, in part, that's just the vocabulary of mixtape, because I think a lot of people were making compilations on their own, but weren't necessarily calling it a mixtape. So I think maybe that's part of it. If you go back even to the late 50s, there's a magazine called Tape Recording. And every month in the Tape Recording, they have a teen corner where people can write in and can talk about their experiences. And a lot of it in the 50s, obviously, is reel to reel. But there's a whole conversation about musique concrète and people who are going out in the street and who are recording sounds. But then there are examples in the 50s and the 60s, a guy who writes in and says, I openly record songs off of the radio, and that's what I use for my DJ sets when I go and I do a show locally. Another guy who says, I record songs and I use them as my background for beat music. So yeah, absolutely, there are people who are using that method all the way through. So it's not just top down. I think kind of where I was coming from is when you see like the recording of people talking about the creation of mixtapes, a lot of times it's these small punk bands that are getting music from each other and hearing about music from one another from the tapes that they're making for each other. And that in some way sort of popularized the concept of sharing music as a mixtape in a more formal way. So like Henry Rollins tells stories about giving mixtapes and getting mixtapes, and Damien Jurado talks about them that way. But no, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. There's definitely great stories of people talking about, I had my Fisher tape, my first cassette player, and I would wait for a song on the radio, and as soon as it would play, I would press record. So yeah, I think there's absolutely both pieces of that. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Good question.
I feel compelled to hold this up. I don't know if you can see it. This is a Personix cassette from back in the days when I made some grad school side money writing catalog copy under the editorship of Kevin Berger. This is made by the Personix system, especially for November Rap 3, and starts with The Real Roxanne, Chub Rock, She Rockers, Golden Years. All right, so Antonia, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, I guess I'll ask the question about where does recording of gospel fall into the history of the recording that you were laying out? I don't study gospel, but a picture of gospel I have in my head is in the 30s or 40s. I don't actually know. So where was the recording of gospel happening, and what labels, that kind of?
Yeah, that one's for me. Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm just going to straight up say it's a weakness of my book that I don't spend more time on gospel. I gesture at it, and it bothers me that it's not more there. But yeah, it's almost obviously. I mean, it comes out in some of the very, very first recordings. So it's there. Very, very early on, and you're getting some sermons from preachers, and you're also getting music in some cases. Folks who did just a few 78s and then never heard from again, and then it takes decades for us to track them down. And there's some really, really great research on gospel that's only happening now. So part of this is about collector culture, and the first things that people went after were tended to be folks looking for what we now call blues, country, and jazz. But in more recent years, a lot more so-called immigrant music, but also the gospel records. People are just really tracking them down, and so it feels like the moment in the last decade or so anyway, to really be thinking about these. And you can't see behind me, but there's some LPs and CDs I want to go over and grab, and there might be actually a couple 78s. The first year I started streaming was also the first year I bought a 78, but it was there from the beginning, and really, really rich variety of things. There's a book out. There's a number of good gospel books that have come out recently, and I'm blanking on a few of the titles. But if you drop me an email or something, and I'll send you. Maybe you're already aware of them, but it's great stuff, front to back. Oh, and then I just would also mention that there are folks doing music. Of course, all these categories were bogus in a certain sense, right? So sort of black string bands mistaken for white, and sort of white performers mistaken as black, and these stories about sort of black blues musicians thinking that Jimmy Rogers was black, and so there's a lot of this sort of interesting sort of along the race line confusions and policing in certain sense too. So I hope I got there. Anyway, thanks. I appreciate it.
And it's possible maybe looking at something like Mark Burford's book on Mahalia Jackson and the
Yeah.
like Apollo Records and Bess Berman, that would be a good place to sort of see the transition from that Depression era moment of recording culture to post-war gospel.
There's a book, I think it's Lerone Martin, I think it is. Is it Preaching on Wax? I think it's a book called Preaching on Wax. There's sort of really early era stuff that he gets to so well. Yeah.
And what's the name of that amazing Dust to Digital box set of gospel recordings? It's called like Goodbye Babylon or something like that.
Yes, I have it. It comes with, talk about sort of the materiality, like in mixtape, like the love of the object, it comes with cotton, from cotton plants inside the box. The box is made out of cedar. It is perversely wonderful. Yeah.
So it's gotten some love on that level for sure. Jeff Melnick, would you like to, what's Kim's great phrase? Unmute yourself and join.
All right, thanks. So first of all, big thank you to all three presenters. Truly great, great talks. And for me, last night I spent 7 hours at a Cambridge City Council Zoom meeting, and this has been like truly the most amazing antidote to that experience. So thanks. So I was really in the chat. I think my first time I jumped in was I was just sort of hitchhiking on what Carl Wilson was getting at, and I had this question about like control, and it's a fairly crude question, but in all the talks I heard these moments of like record companies, the music business, like trying to figure out like is this new thing a threat? Our conversation on Personix was also kind of tied into that, and there's these moments, in all your talks where the record companies or the music business trying to sort of figure out like, can we incorporate this, or do we need to stamp it out? Jehnie was talking about, I grew up with the record sleeves that said home taping is killing the music business. I used to love taking those records out of my hometown library, taping them, then returning them. And so I'm just thinking if it feels available to any of you to talk about, like, are there particular moments where you see that sort of crisis coming to a head? I was thinking about the great chapter in Alex Safe Cummings' book, Democracy of Sound, where she talks about, that first Dylan bootleg and the record companies trying to figure out, like, is this good for us? Like, is this a loss leader? Like, can we monetize this ultimately? So I'm just sort of thinking about those moments of like, where the question is called, for lack of a better way to put it.
I can definitely start, because what you're talking about, that cassette tape is killing music, home taping is killing music, is really a huge part of it. And so there's a long conversation about that exists in the world of hip hop, and specifically the hip hop mixtape, because of sampling and because of things that are being done outside of record labels. And once record labels get a hold of them, and all of a sudden they realize how many samples are in every hip hop album and that they can't afford to pay for those samples, it's part of what kills the original mixtape. And forces those artists to think in different ways. And it's also part of the conversation within the hip hop mixtape of selling versus sharing, because if they share it, then they're not worrying about having to pay for all of those samples. Whereas if they sell it, then suddenly they're going to get in trouble, and there's a whole lot of copyright issues there. And so in the 90s, there's a huge moment when a ton of DJs are shut down, and they're no longer allowed to do the work that they've done because it's seen as stealing music. And so actually there's an episode of the NPR podcast Louder Than a Riot that it specifically mentions shutting down these DJ conversations and really shutting down that style of mixtape. The home taping is killing music is the other really big piece of it, very definitely. And there's a real conversation in the 80s of whether or not mixtapes are fair use. And the real outcome of it is that, in fact, yes, mixtapes are part of fair use. And so as long as you're doing it for personal reasons, it's not infringing on the art. And again, that's where I really see that debate between the recording industry and the artists themselves, because the artists themselves don't have a problem with it. They're doing it as well. And that's where you get sort of that non-commercialism of, don't tell us what our fans want. We know what our fans want. You're trying to do something different that's about making money, and that's not who we are as artists. So I guess that's what I would say specifically in that world of cassettes, definitely.
Yeah, I would say in my book, the whole thing through the 20s anyway was sort of the rise of radio and the recording industry's sort of denial of that, or sort of negotiating with it in different sort of ways. Reminded me a lot of the record industry thinking about the sort of downloading and then streaming, all the different sort of negotiations that occurred. It all happens back there too. And what's fascinating is in the trade press, I really rely on the trade press from that period. It's like sort of company folks telling their retailers, like, well, radio's not killing your business. Maybe you should have a better storefront display. Like, have you dressed up your storefront display lately? Like, here's a story of a guy who did that, and look at his sales. And so there's a lot of sort of blaming the local retailers early on. But I mean, by the late 20s, the writing's really on the wall. And I mean, some Victor Records, I think, didn't try to keep their folks off radio for a time. So yeah, it's great when you do the history, sort of you see these cycles repeating. They're always different each time, but the patterns do start to be discernible, and it can add a lot, so.
I think that issue of control is really fascinating. And my first book, I Take Over, I wrestle with these ideas, and I've written several other places about what I call the piracy panic narrative. And certainly home taping is killing music is one of those kind of moments. But what I noticed is the recording industry, every time a new technology comes up, they use it as a moment to try to clamp down and gain more rights and more control over the recorded music product or the copyright of the intellectual idea. And so at each moment they do that. And one moment that I think it kind of connects more to the contract side is, they said in the early 2000s, we're just being crushed by digital music. So what we need these 360 contracts. And so then the 360 contract becomes kind of this industry standard where they're earning money, not just off the recording rights, but the publishing rights, the live music, merchandise, the image, the likeness. So, they just want to clamp up more and more control.
All right. Well, I think we should probably leave it there as we've getting on the 90-minute mark. But thank you so much to David and to Jehnie and to Kyle.